All right. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the February IDRA monthly meeting. If this is your first time here, IDRA is the Indigent Defense Research Association. We are a loose collective of researchers, practitioners, administrators, and others all interested in the intersection of data and public defense. If you'd like to find out more about us, you can go to indigentdefenseresearch.org. We do a couple things there. You can get a link to our listserv and join there. You can check out our database of papers, and then we also have a monthly new publications list that goes up there in addition to being passed out to the listserv. Thank you to Venita, who's on the call now, who does that portion. I don't want to take up too much time before I pass it over to our presenters. There are still people coming into the waiting room, but I think we can just go ahead and get started. So I'll pass it over to you, Bonnie.
Great. Thank you, Torian. So for those of you who don't know, I'm Bonnie Hoffman. I'm the Director of Public Defense here at the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. I'm super excited to be able to share with you all a little bit about the research that we have had a chance to do and some of the impacts that that's had. In terms of format, we're going to do a short presentation on the research, how it informed our practices or informs practices in Texas. We're going to follow that with a moderated discussion featuring some experienced investigators, and then end with a Q&A opportunity. If folks have questions as we go, please either put them in the chat or just use your hand raise, and we'll work to get them as quickly as we can as we work through the discussion. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Venita Embry from RTI to start off with talking about our research.
Great. Hello, everyone. I'm Venita Embry. I am with RTI International. I'm a court systems researcher and had the great fortune of working with our co-presenters today. RTI is a not-for-profit research institution located in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. And as part of some of the work we did, we worked with NACL, Bonnie, on a Justice for All research TTA project, where we're able to connect with many public defense and criminal legal system actors to help strengthen the Sixth Amendment protection. So as part of this event today, we were focused on making investigators count, so talking about evidence, experience, and training needs in public defense. And as Bonnie mentioned, as part of, we have some data and some survey data about investigator utilization that came from this Justice for All TTA. So we're going to present, just to help start the conversation, present some of the results from that effort. If you attended ASC presentation back in 2023, you might be familiar with some of these slides or seen the reports that we circulated previously. So we're going to, for the sake of time, just stick to some really high-level data findings, but we will share the link or the QR code to that report and welcome any questions about the larger report and findings. So just to mention, this work was supported by the Bureau of Justice Assistance in partnership with the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys, the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, the National Center for State Courts, and RTI. So we came across this project. Texas Indigent Defense Commission noted that 54% of their counties reported zero defense investigator expenditures. And though some of these counties often had actual cases happening, the question is, why were there such an underutilization of investigators? So for this Justice for All TTA project, we decided we wanted to help, TIDC to really understand what are some of the challenges with investigators, how are they being used, what are some data we can collect to really understand this problem. As part of the ABA standards, there's a need to have quality investigation as part of defense process. And the use of investigators is just really known as a valuable part. So this has big implications for the criminal cases that are coming through Texas. And when we looked at just the map, most of these minimal or no dollar expenditures were coming from small and rural communities. So some of the potential reasons for $0 expenditures, are that investigators are being used, but are not being documented and reported consistently to the reporting source. The process for requesting investigators is too difficult or complex, so attorneys are often bypassing this process. There are no investigations occurring. The investigator requests are being denied, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the different structures of how you submit investigator requests. Or there's no investigators available in the county. That makes it challenging to hire one and have them part of your defense team. And so many times we might think that because of those issues, attorneys are just doing the investigations themselves because of their own personal preference, the fear of requesting from the courts, requesting investigators from the courts, the lack of knowledge about how to attain an investigator or how to even incorporate them into your defense team and strategy. And then sometimes the attorney's workloads may be just too high to enable the use of investigators, or there's just not enough pay available to really incorporate them to the work. So overall, there could be just a culture where the use of investigators are not being or not widespread. So this is a lot in this slide, but essentially for this data collection effort, we surveyed investigators in Texas, defense lawyers in Texas, as well as did some interviews with judges who were in some of those counties with zero or minimal investigation expenditures. So there were about 15 judges we interviewed that represented about 5 different counties. And again, this is recorded. So again, and there's a report. So if there's any questions about the data collection methods, please feel free to reach out. That's what we mainly surveyed and reporting some of the results from each of these 3 groups. So just getting to the findings and recommendations. Again, these are more high level of things that are relating to our conversations following this kind of data presentation. So one of the main things we saw was that when we looked at data from the attorneys themselves who reported that they had an investigator on staff versus those who did not have an investigator on staff, we saw that for those who had an investigator on staff who may be embedded in their office, that for different types of cases, they reported that they typically use the investigator. So if they had one in-house, they had a juvenile appointed case, 75% of the attorneys said they typically would use an investigator for support their case, compared to attorneys who had a juvenile appointed case. If they didn't have an investigator on staff, they often did not go out, seek, and hire an investigator to help support that case. And you see that the numbers do increase for things like felony, which makes a lot of sense. But even still, for those who do not have an investigator on staff, 87% of the attorneys said that they would they would get an investigator, leaving about 13% who said they would not. So we see kind of a correlation between having an investigator on staff and using it, which suggests maybe the easy access for investigators could really impact adding one to your defense team. So furthermore, we found that 20% of attorney respondents had access to an investigator within their office or firm. And this could be a mix. And so the folks that we talked to could be folks working at a public defender office, those who are working in a managed assigned counsel program, or private assigned counsel. So there was a really good mix of different types of attorneys. And then we heard on the other side, 30% of attorneys said they had no support staff at all. This can be investigators, social workers, paralegals. Some of these attorneys were just really working on their own for their defense teams. And about half of the attorneys agreed or strongly agreed that it was easy to find an investigator that was willing to work at the court-appointed rate, but then less attorneys felt that there was an adequate number of defense attorneys available in their area, again, speaking to this issue with accessibility. And then our interviews indicated that investigators frequently worked with the same attorneys and that new referrals are often happened by word of mouth. And that this was largely kind of attributed to kind of another finding was that there's not a centralized listing of defense attorneys. So while Texas has like a licensure process, investigators are not required to be licensed. and then not all licensed investigators are willing to take court-appointed work. So there's a little bit of a challenge of finding attorneys, and then even if you do, the attorneys might work with the same investigators because they have built relationships, but as we'll talk about, they may not always have the same skills lined up. Or if you don't have access to an investigator, it's a real challenge to kind of build a relationship and find one in these more kind of desert areas. Many of the investigators that we surveyed often had a law enforcement background, and they reported some specialized training in different areas. But one of the areas that we kind of saw was that there few reported trainings in things like the more digital technology recent areas, such as cell phone forensics or digital data. And that was identified even by those investigators as areas they needed increased training on. So overall, there's a need for more skill-based training as well as education on the role and importance of youth investigators. So 50%, more than 50% of the investigators surveyed said there was not adequate training or mentorship for criminal defense investigators in the state, and only 14% of the attorneys agreed that there was adequate training for lawyers on how to properly use investigators. And when we talked with judges, many of the judges really felt that attorneys should use their own investigations. Again, these were judges who were from those smaller counties that have reported zero or low dollar. But some of the reasons was that they felt that the attorneys had the skills, they were getting paid, it would be a waste of taxpayer money to then add an additional investigator or support staff to the team. And that they were often only approving investigators when they felt that it was a case that was necessary. So we have a quote but then on the other side, there were some judges who said, I just never see investigators' requests coming into the office. So there was kind of a mix between hearing judges say, we never see the request, and then attorneys who are saying, whenever I submit a request, they're rarely approved. So there's this huge culture where there's a disconnect between the utilization of investigators. Okay, so just one of the recommendations, and we'll provide a longer list at the end, is providing this regular training for investigators, defense lawyers, and members of the judiciary, as well as the larger community on the role and importance of defense investigators. Overall, just quickly as a summary of these points, that people do value investigators. And that's the important part, is that people do see them as a valuable member, but when it's that decision making of adding them to the specific case, going through the process, there seems to be a disconnect. And one thing we did hear from investigators was often feeling like they're not brought into the case early enough, or they're really communicated on how they can best support the larger defense strategy versus looking into this particular evidence or talking to this particular witness. So investigators often felt like they needed to be better incorporated into the defense process. For Tim, I'm just going to move through these quotes a little quicker. And the other big area that investigators were often frustrated was compensation rate and payment. As I mentioned, so one of the things that counties in Texas set their own rates, and these rates vary significantly from county to county. And even when they are approved, they may only have a limited number of hours, and attorneys often have to reapply for additional funding. So even if they do get funded by a judge, then they may only get a small amount of hours and then have to go through this process again for payment. And the payment process is not great also, surprisingly. Some folks have mentioned that they're not reimbursed timely. There's different mechanisms for how payment. So if you're an investigator working across multiple jurisdictions, you have to navigate that process, which can be very cumbersome and include their own culture of how payments and the use of investigators kind of navigating all those different roles. So overall, the payment process is a very challenging aspect of investigator utilization. And one of the last major findings is that there were some incomplete and inconsistent practices in reporting investigator expenditures. So that was one of the potential reasons was people are using investigators, but the way it's being documented and the system make it really challenging to understand how investigators are being used. So this is one example of an investigator on the right that was used, but they were paid out of a jury fund. So without knowing this, if you looked in that county, you might see they had no jury, they had no investigator used, but the investigator was actually used, but they were paid from a different source. And so while it's great that they were used for a defense case, it does make it hard to really understand how this county and the community are using investigators. So just some quick study limitations that I wrap things up. We are talking about convenient samples, and this doesn't represent the full state of Texas, but I think it does illuminate some of the culture and challenges with the utilization of investigators and identify some opportunities for further training, technology building, as well as thinking about some of the resources that can be applied to increase utilization of investigators throughout the state. So this is a list of some of the recommendations. Highlighted are those that are really more related to some of the data provided. So really one of the main ones was trying to shift as much of the review and approval process from the judiciary to public defense service providers, promoting early access to investigators, improving compensation practices, training, and improving the data collection and transparency regarding investigators' expenditure and utilization. So I know there was a lot of words and data, but again, we have shared report and we'll continue and we'll share the link to the report following this. But hopefully this sets up some of the ways that this report has been used in Texas, as well as any potential areas for future trainings and resources needed for investigators. So now I'll turn this over to Scott.
Thank you, Venita. I'm going to real quick kind of go over the structure of indigent defense in Texas, how how attorneys get investigators, and talk about some of the things that we have done since this research has been conducted. Next slide. So here we've got a map of public defense offices, which includes public defender offices or managed assigned counsel programs in Texas. All of those colored counties are covered by one of those, either a public defender, a MAC, or both. And so counties, we have 254 counties in Texas. Every county can choose their own indigent defense system within public defender offices, MACs, straight up assigned counsel, contract defenders, or some combination of both. As of October, we had 31 public defender offices covering 83 counties, 8 MACs covering 9 counties. In all, there's 88 counties covered by some form of managed system. Investigators, in terms of how an attorney gets an investigator and uses one in their case. Public defender offices, they have staff investigators who are employees that the attorneys will have access to. Managed assigned counsel programs will either appoint an investigator to an attorney who requests one, or some of them have investigator on staff. Actually, only one, I think, has an investigator on staff. Y'all will hear from Eldon here shortly from Lubbock on how that has worked out very well. And then private assigned counsel and contract defenders, they have to request an investigator from a judge who generally is approving that on the front end before those investigation expenses occur. Next slide. So you can just show us all those bullets, Venita. So in terms of counties with zero investigation expenditures, as Venita said, that was the main reason why we went to NACDL and their group to do this research because um, we were seeing zero investigation in lots of counties. You can see here that that has been slowly declining since the research began. Um, I think one of the big issues that's going on here is we have slowly but surely been adding more and more counties that are covered by public defender offices who have investigators embedded within that county. I like to think that maybe this research made a difference, but I'm not going to lie, there was not like some massive marketing campaign. The word, I'll talk a little bit about how the word was gotten out and what we have been doing, but it's not like we hammer counties every single day, like do more investigation, do more investigation. We've tried to get the word out, but it's hard to say whether, those educational activities that we've been doing, how much that has changed things versus more public defender offices coming online. Next slide. So I just want to give you all a sense of the expenditures and the trends that have been going on since over time. And so you can see since 2021, overall expenditures across the state have been increasing a bit. So on the felony investigations, non-capital, we went from under 8,000 in 2021 up to almost 12 million, excuse me. These are millions of dollars in 2023. And on misdemeanor cases, those have increased somewhat, looks like about $1 million. And then the investigative expenses per case, this is a little bit deceiving because this is across all cases in the state. This is not on a per case basis in the sense of like an investigator got $45 to do an investigation. This is across every single case that was a felony or misdemeanor. So those that, where there was no investigation and no expenditures is averaged in with, a case where, maybe there's $1,000 spent on investigation. So this is the overall average across all of cases. We don't have the data, and this is one of the recommendations that we still need to implement is we don't have data on the number of cases in which an investigation occurred. We just have the total number of expenditures that occurred over case types by county and even by court. But we don't have numbers of cases in which an investigation occurred. And that is a shortcoming of our data that I would like to fix. Next slide. Let's see. Did we miss a slide? Or was that okay? So just in terms of what we have done on the research side of things, and we have policy monitoring where we have monitors who go out and will look into whether or not judges in the counties are following the law, whether they're appointing counsel properly. And one thing that we've added is what's called the quality supplement. And so, as part of that, we do surveys. And this doesn't occur in every policy monitoring we do. We have follow-up monitoring where, if someone wasn't following the law on the first time around, we'll go back within a couple of years and do a follow up to see if they've addressed all the problems that we flagged for them. But on new first time policy monitorings, we're doing what's called the quality supplement, and that includes surveys of attorneys on various issues, including investigation. And so we're collecting data through those surveys. And since 2021, we've done 6 policy monitorings that included quality supplements with questions about investigation. Next slide. So this is just an example that I wanted to provide to y'all from one of our policy monitorings we did in Galveston, which I'd consider, a mid-sized county. The question we asked to the attorneys was, have you had any difficulties receiving adequate funding for investigation? And so, as you can see, there's a wide variety of responses here, including 32% who never requested an investigator. We've got 40% who claim no, they didn't have any difficulties getting adequate funding, but 20% said they did, and then 8% was other. Next slide. And then these are just some of the more basically give them an opportunity to pontificate on what happened or why they answered some way or any additional information they want to give us. And so, as you can see, there's a lot of things that Venita flagged from the research that we saw in Galveston County in 2022. First answer was it's a lot of hassle. I have to file a motion and schedule it for a hearing, add that to the time required to find an investigator, get him on board, interact with him throughout. These are all reasons why someone might not bother with asking for an investigator. Second person says they've been granted, except for once, but they're, dropping the amounts that are being approved. Good and seasoned investigators won't get involved. They're grossly underpaid. They don't want to be hassled with being underpaid and timely payment. And then there's a complaint about one of the particular felony judges there. Let's see. Going down more, they need to be paid more. Some judges only allow for small amounts. I've been told by the investigator that's not enough. And then someone complains there's not enough not enough investigators, and few of them have real experience. So, and that long answer there, you can see, you know, a police officer advising the judge that the attorney is expected to speak to witnesses, and that's not a proper function of a private investigator, which is absolutely incorrect. And the fact that we have police officers advising a judge on what the proper role of an investigator is for the defense is shocking. And there was a question earlier by Bob Berukowitz, I believe, who was, talking about the problem of an attorney talking to a witness, and say that attorney talks to the witness, and that witness says one thing to them, and then they get up on the stand, and then they have a different answer from what they told the attorney. And so, the attorney is now a witness to that statement. And are they supposed to get up on the stand now and, cross-examine themselves? Like, how's that supposed to work? So I don't think judges really fully appreciate the problem of attorneys going to talk to witnesses in cases. Next. On our fiscal monitoring side, we go out and just make sure the counties are spending their money correctly. And so some things that we've found or that we do tell counties as part of our fiscal monitoring, if they have zero expenditures in investigation, we bring that to their attention. In Ector County, which is in West Texas, next to Midland, or maybe I'm sorry, it could be Midland. $72,557 in investigative expenditures were discovered as part of that fiscal monitoring that were not reported on our indigent defense expenditure report. In Henderson County, we found that fiscal monitoring that there was at least one voucher that was classified as an expert cost rather than an investigator cost. And so we are finding that there is reporting problems. And so We are likely over-reporting the number of counties that have zero investigation expenditures because we are reliant upon the counties to report to us, and we're trying to dig into that in ways in which we can, but it's imperfect. Next slide. So here's just some of the things that we've done after the report. We presented it to the board. We've presented the research findings at our indigent defense workshop, which brings together county stakeholders from around the state. We've written articles about it and directed at the judges and defense attorneys, tabling at judicial conferences. We have the report with us. We partnered with Bonnie and NACDL at Texas Tech. We did a training for attorneys and investigators in 2024, and we also presented our findings at the National Defender Investigator Association. Next slide. So this was one of the findings out of the report, talking about how long of a law enforcement career defense investigators had before they became a defense investigator. And as you can see, a majority had more than 20 years of law enforcement experience before coming to the defense side. So as you can imagine, that may cause some culture problems in terms of just, the mindset of that investigator, what they think about clients, the truthfulness of clients, how hard they want to work on behalf of clients. And this is not just a Texas thing. I think you'll find this around the country where a lot of defense investigators have a long career in law enforcement before working for the defense. So after the training at Texas Tech, we asked attendees what they thought about the training, and this was just one of the responses that we got that's kind of indicative of this culture problem. And this feedback, this quote from this attendee said, "I came to learn about I came to learn about uh, my profession, not be lectured about race or to listen to someone try and convince an almost complete room of ex-police that the majority of police are corrupt." And so, this was, their take on the training. We talked about that since, and this arguably is a problem with the presenters and the message that was sent, and we need to take that into consideration. Who is attending these our investigator trainings? And that many of them are law enforcement. And at least this one person, came out of the training, felt attacked, I think. And so we need to keep that in mind when we are doing training. But it also speaks to just where a lot of defense investigators are coming from. Next slide. So some of the things that we have talked about implementing that I think would be a good idea, and these were, came out of the recommendations. Maybe setting up a centralized hub or a managed assigned counsel program for more rural private assigned counsel, which really is one of the big areas where we're lacking right now in terms of use of investigation. So those lawyers could go to this centralized hub, would not have to go to the judge to request an investigator. They could just go to this separate entity, ask for an investigation, and it could be done. Right now, TIDC does not have the ability to contract for services like this, and so that would need to be a legislative change. But that's something else that we could do, is contract for those services to serve assigned counsel in a large region, or also grants to counties to pay a higher percentage or 100% of their investigation costs is something else that be interested to collect some data there to see how investigation changes if we just change how investigation is paid for. And then I've also, talked to the Texas Criminal Defense Lawyers Association. I've heard from investigators who are members there who like more training. So I've been in talks with them on increasing the number of trainings for investigators and attorneys in terms of working with investigators. Next slide. And that's it.
Great. Thanks, Scott. So I think what we're going to do, we're going to jump into bringing in a couple of our investigators and talk a little bit about some of these last points that Scott is really highlighting, which is the value of investigation and this culture piece, which we think is a really big component that the report itself maybe didn't tease out as much, and the data as much as we started to find, the more we really dug into this issue. So I'm going to start with Eldon Whitworth. Eldon is the fact investigator for the Lubbock Private Defender's Office. That's the agency that provides public defense representation in Lubbock County, Texas. And so, Eldon, I want to ask you a little bit about the success you've had. I want if you can maybe give people a little understanding of how you guys brought an investigator on board in your office, the kind of work that you're doing, and really importantly, I think for this group, the kind of data that you're starting to track and see with the rise of your office's use of investigators.
Thanks for having me. I After I retired from federal law enforcement, I got my PI license and started dabbling in it, taking on contract jobs here with the Lubbock MAC, anywhere from 10 to maybe 30 cases a year on a contract basis. And in 2020, the director approached me and said, "Hey, we've been looking at this. We're spending in the neighborhood of $60,000, $70,000 a year to handle 30 cases. What would happen if we brought you on full time?" And so the county was convinced, the board was convinced. I was brought on full time, and the very first year handled over 150 cases for the same amount that the county was paying for 15 to 20. Since then, we have grown so much that I've had to hire another investigator, and we're looking at hiring a mitigation specialist right now. We are currently handling around 300 cases a year, where in contrast to 5, 6 years ago where it was 30. So that's what the difference is as far as the access to an investigator. You're going to show some stats here in a moment.
We are. I think
Yeah.
if Venita can pull up that new slide.
Yeah,
So we're going to talk
one
a
thing
little
I
bit.
want to point out to
Yeah.
this is that these stats are not just based on access, but also based on training that myself and my investigator received to make us competent investigators, to make us present a quality work. One of the biggest hampers that I had when I first started out is anytime I did an investigation and found information that was contrary to what the police had, I'd be pulled up to the stand, and the DA spent all their time trying to degrade me as to what my qualifications or status was, trying to make you look bad for the jury. I've since become a board certified criminal defense investigator, which is only about 300 of us in the whole nation. And that has helped tremendously with the credentials in the court. Hal Humphreys is one of the trainers that I use in this. He's also a licensed investigator and puts out a lot of good information to help investigators like myself put out quality work. So this data here, once I came on in 2020, like I said, we were handling around 30 cases, and it jumped up very quickly. This is a 5-year run. We've handled a little over 1,300 cases now, with 1,122 of them that have been closed out in the courts. It means we've had a disposition on it. Of those, we are pre-indictment rejections, which we just started pushing this last year. But before that, we were just handling cases that were already indicted. But this last year, we've really been pushing our attorneys to bring us the pre-indictments, and we're seeing a big change there. About a 6%, 7% rejection rate in those cases. Plea agreements, this is getting knocked down from maybe a first-degree felony to a Class A misdemeanor, getting a lot of different time knocked off and stuff. The trials, there's going to be some that no matter what investigation do, they're guilty. They're found guilty. But that is also not reflected here, is a lot of that gets mitigated down in the sentencing. Whereas they may have been looking at life, or now they're looking at 15, 20 years. We've had some really good luck, including a few murder cases where we get some not guilties due to the investigative work. And then the big thing is our dismissal rate. We're looking at right at about 50% dismissal rate of any case that we're assigned. it's going to more than likely come up dismissed. I can tell you that our assault cases are the big partition of that. We're probably looking around 70% of all assault cases that are dismissed once we're put on that. Just for the simple fact that when police get there, they're doing triage. They quickly assess the situation. They take the witness's word as gospel and they put it in a police report. And there's no other research done after that unless it's a major, murder case or something. And so all the courts had to go on is what the police officer happens to put in that report. But we go out and we identify and interview further witnesses that have more to put, more to give. We canvass the scenes for related information and evidence that has a big impact on what the jury or maybe even the DA will consider as whether they're going to present this case further. We analyze the records that are given, not only the police report, but other records such as mental health records, medical records, other people's criminal history records, and it all plays a big part in what we see as a result of this. Every month I take a day off to just focus on the cases that we closed out through the month and what we've done with them, what the results were, and I documented that for the last 5 years, and that's how we come up with these results.
And I want to ask you, Eldon, and I'm going to ask Venita, if you can put up maybe just this last slide that has the link to the report for folks. But I want to ask you about this one little piece of it, because I think there's an important component that maybe it's hard for us to always realize. You had described, sort of this growth as you've come in-house, more cases are coming your way.
Yes.
I think we, in doing our research, felt that this in part was about an ease of access. But, I think you've started to hint at this a little bit, that it's more than just ease of access. Is there, some value to just growing? Success breeds success, right? Your success encourages more attorneys to use investigators, which allows that success to kind of proliferate. So can you maybe just share with folks real quick, and then we're going to jump over to Hal, talk a little bit about sort of this culture and training, but how you've kind of seen that cycle grow, right? That by being in-house, that you're seeing more people come to you because you're having more success.
Yeah, I mean, as we started getting a higher amount of dismissals or plea bargains knocked down, which, diminishes the cost to the public in trial costs and incarceration costs, and people don't think about that. But as we were having luck with that, the word got out real quick. Hey, we got an in-house investigator. You don't have to fight with the judge to go get him. And then as they started using us and we started having better luck and we started beating cases in the courts, the reputation of quality investigation got out. And of course, everybody wants the best of what's out there. So, and as that started elevating and giving us more work and more work to do here, we weren't just satisfied with keeping it the way it was. We went out and got certifications and more experience training to fine tune our trade.
So with that, I'm going to use that as my entry point to bring Hal into this conversation. And I think, Hal, there are two things that we really want to get into with you. One is what Eldon's talking about, which is the importance of training and certification, in the skill that allows the investigators to really bring to their work. But I think there's this second component that Scott started to touch on a little bit as well, which is culture. The fact is, the overwhelming majority, I don't think our data in Texas is probably going to, if other places were to be studied, experience as probably not an outlier, that a large majority of defense investigators are former law enforcement officers. And that can bring a lot of skill to the field. That can sometimes, I think, be a really effective tool to undercut some of what Eldon was describing, which is that cross-examination and challenging of the witnesses' qualifications. But it does also create this culture tension because inherently, right, the defense is a place in which we spend a lot of time, trying to undercut law enforcement and law enforcement investigations. So can you talk a little bit about sort of how that unfolds, and maybe also how that plays into the training and the kind of training work that we should be thinking about?
Sure.
Yeah. So
I'm gonna let Hal jump in if that's all right, Eldon.
Good.
The thing that I would say about that is if you look at the stats that were presented earlier, 52% of the investigators have 20 plus years in law enforcement. There are two things to think about there. Number one, That's the majority have, at least 20 years of law enforcement experience. And then whatever the other stats were, there's still the overwhelming majority is former law enforcement. That's not inherently bad. They've got extensive training. They've got the skills. They know how to approach witnesses. These are all really important skills to have. I would point out that, if you've got 20 years experience in law enforcement, there's a probability that you have a pension of some kind. And the impetus to get out and work in the seams, example, really early in the morning before people go to work, or really late in the afternoon when people get home from work, is not as strong because you've got a source of income. This is kind of a side gig at that point. As far as the training goes, one of the things that we talk about a lot in our training at PI Education is we're not asking you, former law enforcement, to come over to the dark side. We're asking you to work in defense of the Constitution of this country that we live in. And that lands a lot of times with people from law enforcement that are getting into the private investigations world. They're not fighting their law enforcement brothers. They're defending the Constitution. And I think that's one of the things that has landed really well from our education stuff.
So I think, how you come into this work, you did not come in with a law enforcement background.
No.
And how do you see, because I think, for us in the defender community, it's one of our big questions is, as you start to think about bringing folks in-house, is what should I be looking for? If I'm going to have investigation, Eldon's made clear, like, quality matters, because if you have an investigator but you're not having success, then both attorneys aren't going to use it, and also, right, that's not then a good use of our resources. So what are maybe, thinking a little bit about what people should be looking for when they're thinking about investigators?
From an attorney's perspective, looking for an investigator, the relationship between the investigator and the attorney is one that takes trust, and trust takes a while to build. So you're going to have to look and meet investigators. And part of this is on the private investigator set. We need to do a better job of getting out in front of attorneys and educating them on what we do. The other piece of that is when ask the question again, Bonnie. Sorry.
It's okay. Because I'll probably just ask a different question.
Yeah.
I think it's thinking about that idea, like, what should we be looking for as defenders in making some hiring decisions?
That's the part that I missed. So I came to this work from the world of real estate valuation, and it seems like a total non sequitur to hop into the world of private investigations. But the skill set that I came to the table with is research, interviews, analysis, drawing conclusions, and presenting my findings to a client. That's what a private investigator does. That's what a defense investigator does. So if you're looking at people mid-career that are coming out of a different field, look for analytical skills. Look for the ability to get on the phone or meet people in person and talk to them. That's what you're looking for in an investigator. If I've got that skill set as a trainer, I can take anyone with that skill set and turn them into a competent investigator. And sometimes with the law enforcement set, there's some unlearning that needs to happen in terms of, you don't have a badge. You don't have the ability to basically force someone to talk to you. You've got to rely on, charm and good looks. And as we can tell, Eldon and I are struggling in one of those areas.
But I think, we as we think about this, and I'm going to maybe pull Scott back up as well, because, some of this is this conversation around how do we make, investigator usage accessible across the board. And I think, Scott, there's this piece we're talking about, which is the quality of the investigators. We've talked about creating ways to make them accessible through lists and some of these other steps. But, I think over and over again, an area that we heard a lot about was just this barrier of process, whether it was having to file a motion and go through the process, whether it was, the court's gatekeeper function. And I'm curious from each of you to think about, what might be some good things that can help facilitate the process, some of which I'm going to go to you first, Hal, because you raised your finger first, like you have something to say. Right. But it is a complexity that some of them are more in our control. Some of them are going to require other changes, right? Changing the role judges play, very different than maybe some of those like lower hanging fruit kind of changes, which I'm assuming, Hal, you're going to pick and not pick. We should get the legislature to change practices.
Well, I would just suggest that the idea that Scott floated earlier about working with TCDLA on educating attorneys on how to use investigators is probably the best and most critical piece of the puzzle, because a lot of attorneys do not fully understand what it is they're supposed to do with an investigator. So, Scott, you want to talk about that process that you're working on with TCDLA?
Yeah, well, that is still being fleshed out in terms of like what those trainings would look like. It is, yeah, I feel like investigation, it's one of these things where it's kind of like touched upon or just kind of mentioned in passing with attorney trainings, and it's not really delved into. Like we even tried to do this at the training in Lubbock. Um, and I was, a little disappointed with the presentation just because I think the attorney who did it, he's been around a long time. Like he's an expert, and at the same time, he's only dealing with like a certain number of counties as well. And so we have 254 counties. And within those counties, there's like multiple judges. And so when you're talking about like asking for an investigator in Texas, you're going to see like a wide range of judicial attitudes towards investigation, whether or not, they think it's a waste of money. They're also particularly, like a small county on misdemeanors. The head executive of that county is also the judge who is sitting in court. And so he's particularly tuned into like the money situation because at the end of the day, like he's part of the group that's, approving the budget. Um, so that's a whole other issue. And so, and then even beyond that, one thing that we didn't touch on really in a big way here, but I think is a big problem is getting investigators paid and paid enough that they want to do the work. We heard multiple complaints of people at that training, as well as responses to our survey, as well as these, policy monitoring reports that we're doing. A common complaint from investigators is I don't get paid enough, or I don't get paid for a long time. And so, how you were telling me about this problem existing in Tennessee too, where, you said you had $25,000 in unpaid bills, and that ain't right.
Yeah, yeah, and that's not just Tennessee and Texas. It's kind of across the country for private investigators out there working on the indigent defense side of things.
Yeah. And so you're never going to get, you're not going to get investigators to be interested in doing that work, if that's how they're treated. And so, part of this is a money thing. Part of it is a gatekeeper thing where, we have the evidence and it's not rocket science to figure out if you have an independent entity that is, solely interested in providing quality indigent defense, and they are the gatekeeper for investigation expenditures and how much you're going to get. That result, I think, is going to be a lot different and easier. I practice a little bit here in Travis County where they have a managed assigned counsel program. And, it was very easy to just put in a request, if it was the type of case and the type of activities that the investigators should be doing, they would approve it with no questions asked. And so, from my perspective, that's the way it should be. You shouldn't have to file a motion. You shouldn't have to argue for in order to get that investigator. And not to mention just like give away information potentially that's really kind of impacting the case down the road potentially.
So yeah, so Scott, I'm gonna cut you off here for just a second because we have a couple of good questions I want to make sure we get to, and I think a lot of us share your feelings and your concerns about this. But I want to jump into a couple of things that have been put up here in the chat, and they really relate to some of this education and training. So the first question that had come in was a question about educating attorneys, and I'm going to tell folks that shortly, as in maybe in the coming weeks, we are going to be able to share with you all recordings of trainings that we've been able to do through this grant funding, including the trainings that we did in Texas, to be able to share with attorneys some of that material around how do we as attorneys do a better job of using investigators, better ways that we can use them, use their skills and really take advantage and build a good collaboration. But the second question that had come up was this idea, going back to non-law enforcement investigators and thinking about folks who may really, make good investigators. They have good people skills, they have good communication skills. But what are, kind of some of those things that we should be thinking about in terms of content when we're bringing in those non-law enforcement folks into this space? As opposed to that area about like how do we untrain law enforcement about some of the tools that they've sort of maybe lost when they've come to do defense investigations. So if maybe we can kind of close out on that, because I'm mindful of the fact we got just a couple of minutes left here.
Eldon, did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I've like I said, I've had to hire a new investigator to help me out, and that was a big issue with me. I probably interviewed 15, 20 people. I started out with one that was prior law enforcement. He was an outstanding investigator, but then he moved on to bigger, better things. So I then had to start all over again, and I hired one that was not law enforcement. The main thing that they have over the non is they've been trained all these years on analyzing evidence, understanding the rules of procedure, understanding the different factors of each crime, to whether it meets the elements or not, and then we can transition our questioning, our investigation, into see if those elements are met, and that is a lot of what helps with the dismissals.
Yeah.
How-
I think, Bonnie, the best way to train non-law enforcement investigators on the work is the bulk of the work that I do as a criminal defense investigator involves interviewing witnesses. That is the overwhelming majority of my time is out in the field, knocking on doors, talking to witnesses. And what we train our investigators on is preparation and making the approach and conducting the interview. Those three elements are just the most critical pieces. If they can do those things and document the conversations they have with the witnesses, then the attorneys can work with that material, however they see fit. But if we can train them up on preparing for the interview, making the approach, doing it safely, doing it in a way that's not threatening that kind of business, and then conducting an interview, those are the three things. And Scott posted a thing earlier about hiring journalists as investigators. There are 300 journalists that used to work for the Washington Post that are available to be defense investigators, and they would be fantastic.
Yeah, and I think I'm gonna take that as we kind of wrap up here. I think one of our big takeaways was at the end of the day, there was, I think, very little question about the high value investigators bring to cases for the clients, for case outcomes, for being able to help the attorney spend their time better, to really lean into the expertise that investigators bring to the table. And that a lot of this now becomes two big components. Logistically, how do we grow defender offices to have the capacity to have, and what does that access look like? And then within the office, whether it's a defender office, a managed assigned counsel program, a community, how do you build a culture that is going to take advantage and work in a functional and a healthy way when it comes to this? So as I said, we're going to be excited to share with you all, I think, hopefully before the end of the month, access to some training materials that really focus, especially for attorneys, on how to work better with investigators, because that is a large component of this, is how we improve our attorneys' end for that work. So we'll be sharing that with you all in the coming weeks. And with that, I want to just thank our panelists. I want to thank Idra for giving us a chance to really share this research and this work. We think this is really important. And we would love if there are places that are looking to add investigators to their programs and are interested in getting access to the survey tools we use, some of the data we collected were, I know that the team would be happy to talk about what we did and use this as a chance to kind of build so that other places can improve their work as well.
Thank you, Bonnie, and thanks to all the panelists. I think we'll call the meeting there. We will be posting this up on our YouTube channel as well. So thank you again, everyone.
Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, guys.
Have a good one. Have a good weekend.